Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into this truly fascinating shift that's happening right now in coastal towns across the country. For decades, building and maintaining a saltwater reef aquarium, well, it's basically been viewed as this totally solitary pursuit. Usually just a lone hobbyist crying over water parameters in their living room. But that is fundamentally changing. Today, we're exploring how this deeply technical, highly individual hobby is evolving into a thriving, collaborative ecosystem of its own. It's an absolutely brilliant transformation, and I literally cannot wait to show you exactly how it's happening.
But before we get into the solutions, we really have to understand the problem, right? So if you've ever started a reef tank, or let's be real, if you've tried and watched it completely crash, what is the absolute biggest barrier to entry? Most people instantly assume it's a lack of dedication. They think, oh, it's just too hard, and people give up. But when we actually look at the data and talk to the organizers in these coastal communities, we find out that enthusiasm is rarely the issue. The real answer is actually much, much more systemic.
The real barrier is access. It really comes down to three crucial things: finding reliable guidance, sourcing livestock ethically, and, oh boy, managing those notoriously high equipment costs. We absolutely have to empathize with beginners here. Just imagine trying to build a delicate, complex marine ecosystem in your house, completely alone. You're facing this massive initial investment, totally contradictory advice on the internet, and a deeply frustrating trial and error period that, honestly, usually ends with you spending a small fortune just to grow some premium algae. Trying to navigate all of that in isolation, that's exactly what pushes incredibly passionate people right out of the hobby.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think of this as our community building blueprint. We'll start with the reef keeping barrier, then move into mentorship and shared knowledge. After that, we'll look at swaps and responsible sourcing, then reducing our environmental impact, and finally, we'll wrap up with building a shared identity. Basically, we're going to journey from a struggling micro-ecosystem in a single beginner's tank all the way to a thriving, sustainable coastal network. Starting off with Section 1, the reef keeping barrier, going from isolated struggles to shared solutions. So the culture in these coastal towns is really fundamentally shifting from viewing a reef tank as this top-secret solo project to treating it as a real shared community endeavor. And just look at the contrast here between the old way and the new way. The solo hobbyist is traditionally trapped in this awful cycle of trial and error. They're dealing with crazy high costs, constantly chasing the latest skimmer tech just because they don't know how to optimize what they already have, and relying on wild-caught corals. But the community project model? It completely flips the script. By pooling resources and expertise, that frustrating trial and error actually turns into collective learning. I mean, we're talking about equipment libraries instead of individual purchasing and prioritizing captive-bred alternatives over wild harvesting. It's a highly efficient, super collaborative system that immediately lowers that barrier to entry. Moving on to Section 2, mentorship and shared knowledge, cultivating success at the micro level. Now, this is where we zoom in on the human element, which is honestly the absolute heartbeat of this whole transformation. Local groups are replacing all that isolated guesswork with volunteer reef coaches. These experienced aquarists aren't just dropping one-off advice on some random internet forum. They're providing structured, collective learning. The onboarding process starts right at step 1 with mastering water quality testing and vital parameters, like alkalinity stability. Then it moves into step 2, lighting schedules and careful acclimation. But the real magic happens in step 3, the crucial first-month check-ins. Rather than a quick weekend workshop, communities are actually pairing newcomers with mentors for ongoing support during those super tough first few months. Having someone you can just text when your parameters suddenly spike, that is literally the difference between quitting entirely and successfully keeping that highly sensitive acropora thriving. And this mentorship, it builds into a massive ecosystem of data. Communities are using shared tools like community databases of test results, really detailed checklists for transitioning corals, and shared logs for documenting both growth and setbacks. This level of transparency is just incredible. It actively prevents new members from repeating the exact same mistakes their peers made a year ago. By sharing all this data, beginners can collectively figure out how to manage those really tricky nutrient balances without losing expensive livestock in the process. It's a total game changer. All right, let's look at Section 3, swaps and responsible sourcing, expanding the local ecosystem. Now, what's really interesting about this is that as these local groups grow in confidence and knowledge, they inevitably start expanding through in-person frag swaps and equipment exchanges. But these meetups have evolved to be about way more than just scoring a rare coral for cheap.
They are actively elevating community husbandry standards. Because they're trading with their actual neighbors, communities are setting informal best practice standards. So we're seeing strict quarantine routines, basic health screenings before a coral is ever traded, and incredibly clear labeling for species and care requirements. Basically, the community regulates itself, ensuring that only healthy, pest-free livestock is circulating.
And the impact of all this local trading? It goes way beyond the neighborhood. By sourcing from one another, these local swap networks are actively reducing the pressure on wild reefs. Event programming now regularly includes serious educational conversations about where this livestock actually comes from. They're teaching propagation techniques, demanding verified supply chains from the local stores, and heavily promoting captive-bred alternatives over wild-caught ones. It is literal local action resulting in massive global conservation.
Which brings us to Section 4, Reducing Environmental Impact, the macro-level conservation.
So the crucial point is that beyond just keeping corals alive, these groups are tackling the environmental footprint of the hobby itself. When you pull resources, you drastically cut down on solitary waste. I mean, think about it. Instead of every single person buying a wildly expensive par meter that they use exactly once a year, communities are building equipment libraries. Instead of everyone driving to the store separately, they organize bulk purchases of testing supplies to cut down on costs and all that packaging. They even share maintenance tips that lower water and electricity use. And the undeniable truth here is that better maintenance habits, like disciplined feeding, actually support longer coral lifespans, which drastically reduces the overall turnover of livestock.
Finally, Section 5, Building a Shared Identity, the Psychological Anchor. Now, we really need to talk about the emotional glue holding this entire ecosystem together. Reef keeping is not a fast-paced hobby, not at all. It is highly technical, it requires immense patience, and frankly, it can be discouragingly slow. Community leaders have noted that social connection is a massively underrated driver of success in this space. I mean, when you're staring at a tank of rocks, literally waiting for bacteria to cycle for 6 weeks, it helps to have cheerleaders, right? Celebrating seemingly small milestones, like finally locking in those parameters, or seeing a tricky frag successfully encrust, provides immense motivation. Seeing others progress gives hobbyists the psychological resilience they need to survive those completely unavoidable setbacks. The organizers of these groups actually share a really unified vision. They say that by linking hands-on mentorship with broader reef awareness, they hope to grow hobbyist communities that protect ecosystems while making reef care more accessible. And honestly, that beautifully sums up how the hobby has evolved. It's no longer just about having a pretty tank in your living room. It has become a genuine force for conservation. Looking ahead, these communities are planning to strengthen their partnerships with marine educators, specialty stores, and conservation organizations to push this mission even further. Which leaves me with a final thought for you to ponder today. We've seen how reef keepers turned an isolating, super expensive struggle into a vibrant, sustainable, and highly educational community network. So look at your own life. How could your solitary hobby transform into a community project? What could you actually achieve if you stopped working in total isolation and started sharing your knowledge, pooling your resources, and celebrating the small milestones together? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep sharing, and I'll see you next time.